And I'll just say, welcome to our fifth and final week again of the Bible Here and Now, looking at what the death of Jesus tells us about him and us. So we've spent the last 4 weeks looking at the four different Gospels, doing, again, some relatively quick overviews, but trying to get a sense for some of the particularities of first Mark and then Matthew and then Luke and then John, and the way in which they tell the story of Jesus' death, because all of them are telling the story in a way that's trying to highlight certain details. Some of that is a function of memory, perhaps, how the church around them has remembered Jesus. Some of that might be the ways in which they are trying to tell the story to fit a certain context, to try to encourage believers that they know in their own setting to think in certain ways or to act in certain ways. And our gift, I guess, 2,000 years later or 1,900 years later, is to have four books or four accounts that aren't exactly the same in every respect. And we talked about that a little bit in previous weeks. But I want tonight to try to pull together some commonalities or some common threads from what we've looked at over the last 5 weeks to try to answer the question of, well, so what, right? Or what do we do with the reality of multiple gospels and the reality of multiple stories and multiple perspectives. So I'll try to save some time for questions and answers as well tonight and some discussion. But I do want to begin by just offering some reflections on just memory and the telling of a story and how this particular story has been told and has been remembered throughout the centuries. I want to do that by talking just a little bit about art and the ways in which the visual arts play a part in our encounter with the story of Jesus and his death. Maybe the most simple artistic symbol that the church has leaned upon is that of just a cross, just a simple cross. The fact that this is maybe the most recognizable symbol of our faith is interesting, that a cross was chosen instead of, say, a manger or instead of something else in the life of Jesus, that the cross has become, the quintessential symbol, a symbol of death, a symbol of execution, right, of capital punishment, of an attempt, a political attempt to silence Jesus or to discredit Jesus. Different Christian traditions decorate their crosses in different ways. Some include a body on it as a reminder of the death of Jesus. Protestant traditions tend to be more interested in empty crosses as a reminder of that you can't separate crucifixion from resurrection as well. But that cross is such an interesting symbol, especially today when the cross is essentially in the public domain, right? People can do whatever they want with crosses. They show up all over the place on T-shirts and album covers back in the day. Tattoos and jewelry and all sorts of ways, both sacred and perhaps more profane. One thing that's interesting to note, or one thing that I find interesting to note, is that the early church, the earliest Christians, as far as we can tell, were pretty reluctant to use the cross as a symbol, especially an image of the cross with Jesus on it. In fact, we find very few instances of Christian symbolism or iconography or Christian art from the first couple of centuries that used crosses. There are a few exceptions. Here's a gemstone from roughly the year 300. If you're not an aficionado of Christian history, in 300, the Christian church was still a relatively small minority in the Roman Empire. Within about 25 years from this point in time, however, a Roman emperor named Constantine would express Christian faith, or more importantly, he would give a kind of imperial sanction to the church and would start to fund the church, would give money so that cathedrals could be built and so that texts, Bibles could be reproduced. But before that time, we have perhaps some depictions of crosses made by Christians, but I don't think there's any that anybody knows of that actually show a body on the cross. And when there is a body on the cross, if you notice on this one, the body looks pretty healthy. There's not a sense of a broken body or a strong sense of the violence connected to crucifixion. And that carries on even into the following century and the time after Constantine. So this is from the year 425. Here you have a depiction of Jesus on the right, obviously on the cross. On the far right is the soldier piercing his side. Um, in the center of this piece, it appears to be Mary and the beloved disciple. And then, of course, on the left, you've got Judas there. In the Gospel of Matthew, he hangs himself, and you see the bag of coins beneath him. Judas is, that's, you could say that the depiction of Judas is perhaps more violent than the one of Jesus. At least Jesus' body looks relatively strong there. You might debate whether or not there are physical signs of suffering. He's not sagging. There's perhaps a display of strength in how he looks on the cross. So even though we have a depiction here of Jesus crucified, there still is a sense of his own perhaps honor or his own strength or his own ability to withstand what's happening to him. We see that as well in a basilica that was built in the 5th century, with has a depiction. This is really a dark image. I realize it might be hard to see. We have Jesus in the center and 2 other crucified figures next to him. Again, looks relatively strong. His body is muscular and big. He's not lean and necessarily sagging in other ways. The $1 million question here is, if indeed Christians in the first couple of centuries were reluctant to display Jesus crucified, why might that have been? And one of the answers that gets put out there by a lot of art historians and theologians and historians is that the depiction of crucifixion would have been in many ways so offensive to others that the church was hesitant to use it. That the church was perhaps afraid or perhaps reluctant to display their Lord, their leader, on a cross because of all of the shame, all of the humiliation that would represent. And when they did depict him crucified, they were careful to, again, to show him relatively, again, unmoved or not suffering, not with a broken body or not covered in blood or things like that. That starts to change once we get into the 6th century and beyond. And so here's just an example from a 6th century writing where you've got on the top half here a depiction of Jesus, who I think looks a little more frail. You've got him being pierced there by soldiers. And then when we get into the Middle Ages, you're probably familiar with much more graphic, much more bloody, much more uncomfortable images of the crucifixion. One of the questions then is, why is that? Why might the church have been more eager to show Jesus in a posture of strength early on? And I think at least one of the best hypotheses that I've read on this is that the church was really worried when it didn't have much kind of social power or much social influence to depict Jesus that way, lest the symbol be misunderstood. That they were worried perhaps that just putting a cross out there, putting a cross of a suffering Jesus, would lead the wider world to misunderstand the symbol and perhaps to misunderstand the sense of strength or the sense of accomplishment that the cross was supposedly symbolizing. As you get into the Middle Ages now, art is essentially under state control, under the church's control. The church has a lot more power to make sure that nobody is misusing or misunderstanding its symbols or its artistic representations of Jesus. That may or may not be true. It's an interesting thing just to think about, I think. It becomes all the more interesting when we imagine that today there is no real control over artists. I mean, there are market controls, obviously, but people are free to depict a crucified Jesus in almost any way that they want, at least in this country. They might get some pushback in certain ways, and that certainly has happened over the years. But it raises the question of, how does the church depict Jesus crucified or talk about Jesus crucified when there's a variety of ways to interpret? And as you see, I like to use a lot of art when I teach. I could put it alongside of texts to help us imagine, to maybe use more parts of our brain than just words alone depict. But I do want to make sure that we spend a little bit of time tonight commenting just on the power of images in telling this story. Nowhere in the Gospels is there a story of Mary holding the body of her deceased son. But of course, we see this all over the place in a lot of art, made most famous perhaps by Michelangelo in this sculpture. And the deep pathos here of a mother not only outliving her child, but having to watch or having to experience such a brutal form of death, and this moment of deep care for him and a deep pain that she experiences in the time between crucifixion and burial is, of course, touching. This isn't a depiction of crucifixion, but it's a depiction of a part of the story that we want to imagine perhaps might have happened, right? What would it have been like for Mary to experience this? And this has created all sorts of imitators in many ways, or people who have taken this theme and developed it in different ways from a variety of cultures. But it's, again, part of, I think, the power of the story. Bible scholars like myself like to work with texts. We like to talk about details. We like to talk about particularities and history. And we've spent a lot of time doing that over the last 4 weeks. But I wanted to make sure that we didn't end our time together without also talking about the power of images. And again, the power to recreate images and to make images more contemporary. And what does this look like when we think of other instances of mothers having to witness the death of sons or bury their sons or lament a sense of waste or of lives being wiped out for no good reason. That's part of the story too. Some of us like more realist art. We want to imagine what it might have really looked like and want everybody to be dressed in first century clothing. Some of us like art that modernizes, art that's not bound by a particular time in history or particular kind of rules for how do you represent the death of Jesus, but recognize that this is a story that gets told and retold in a variety of ways. And so I did, again, like I said, I wanted to make sure, and we spent a little bit of time talking about that power of images, because all of us, I think, or I'd say most of us, that's probably fairer, most of us probably conceptualize the story of Jesus' death in our own minds in a variety of ways, right? You might have a sense of John's story or Luke's story, but we've watched enough film probably, or seen enough images or heard enough sermons that we kind of blend all of those together in our minds to tell a singular story. I might have used this joke already in a previous week, but we do the same thing at Christmas pageants where we have children dressed up as shepherds like they are in the gospel according to Luke. And then as soon as the shepherds are done with their scene, the Magi come in, and they're only in the gospel according to Matthew, right? We're always merging Luke's gospel and Matthew's gospel when we tell the story of Jesus' birth, in part because it makes a better story and it gives more parts for the children to play in the pageants. But it's just the way we remember things. And I think we live in a culture, especially today, that's so shaped by images. And more, I think, by video, at least as I talk to my children and how they experience the world and how they communicate to each other. That it's worth talking about, again, the power of this story. A lot of times you'll hear Bible scholars like me say, well, that happens in Luke, not in John. That's us trying to say, let's make sure we respect the integrity of each author's story. But I also want to recognize the way we're always conflating the stories. We're always combining the stories to tell them. And that's, I think, also part of the power of having 4 gospels and 4 different accounts. Let me pause there. That's all by way of introduction and making sure we spend a little bit of time with the visual and with our aesthetic sense of this story as well. Are there comments there, or people want to, are there particular artistic renderings that have stuck with you, or that that you want to talk about in terms of how an artist has to choose what to focus on and how to depict Jesus, how to depict his own suffering or lack thereof becomes really important as well.
I like the last image that you showed because it brings it really up to date. We see that going on now where Black mothers have to grieve the loss of their Black sons. So it makes it very contemporary. I like that.
It does. There's an African-American photographer who's done a series of that, of reenacting the Pietà, but in different places and different image in different positioning of the bodies as well, but all with African American mothers and their sons. That's really moving. I didn't include any because everywhere I found on the web has very strong copyright notices. But I will, if you email me about it, I'll send you the link to it. I forgot to copy that link for you as well, but they're very powerful.
Matt, a question. What I'm missing now in each of these stories is the theology of the gospel writers behind what they wrote, and how that affects how they describe that, who Jesus was and how he came to be and all that.
It's a good question. In some ways, we're gonna move toward that in the next part tonight, and some of that I'm also going to let be because they're really huge questions. Right? Mark's gospel, for example, says very little to kind of explain the crucifixion. It just mostly just makes us watch or makes us experience it. John's gospel says a little more when Jesus says things like, when I'm lifted up, I'll draw all people to myself. And Matthew's gospel has a bit of accent on forgiveness being part of the cross. But it's really interesting that the gospel authors tend to decline the opportunity to explain this is what it means, or this is what's happening, or this is what it makes possible. Other New Testament authors do, and in some ways that's why I'm going to talk about Paul during the Easter season, because Paul certainly wants to talk about what it means, but that's part of it too. Part of it is the beauty of, or at least maybe the characteristic of the New Testament is largely narrative. Instead of having a Bible that says, here are the 50 things you need to believe, most of our Bible is story, right? Is storytelling and inviting us into an experience. Now, that doesn't mean that those are separate things, but it means perhaps there's a little more experience as opposed to just, taking something in our head that's important to notice as well. But I'm glad you brought that up, right? That's one of the things that we haven't gone too deeply into yet.
Matt, is there a thought that that the artists that choose to do different crucifixion artwork or other stories from the Bible, do we generally believe that they are Christians themselves? Maybe that's a little bit different take on the first question, but do we generally believe that they are Christians and this is their view?
The ones from the ancient world?
And today. I mean, we use a lot of artwork at Westminster. It's sort of a broader question, but does it matter to you? And do we typically think that people that are doing this type of artwork are people of faith?
I think from the ancient world, let me just maybe say like the first 5 centuries or so, it appears that they are all people, almost all are people of faith, because a lot of this art appears on things like caskets or on church buildings or things like that. It appears to be art that was commissioned in some way. One of the earliest depictions we have of Jesus on a cross is actually a piece of graffiti. It's a line drawing from, I believe, the 2nd century, we think. And it's a picture of a man next to a cross, and on the cross is a stick figure, and it's got a horse's head. It's got an ass as its head. And the graffiti says it's Alexandromas worships his God. And so, interesting, one of the earliest depictions we have of Jesus on a cross appears to be written by somebody who's not a believer, who's using graffiti to mock the church, right? Or to mock at least a particular Christian named Alexandromanos. So there's an example. I think most of the medieval art is probably by people who are within the church, or at least approved by the church in some way. And today, it can be, this is the thing, anybody can depict crucifixion. And so I don't know about the Westminster collection in terms of who's done all of those pieces. That'd be a good question for Rodney maybe one day, but what I like about art, and especially sometimes art that shocks me, that's a little bit disturbing or edgy, is it pushes me to think about ways in which I might have been constraining the story too much. And so I personally like it when people outside the church create art that's provocative in some way, shape, or form. I can imagine things that are just utterly blasphemous that probably I wouldn't want to spend time with. And that's, but all artists know what that's like, right? To push boundaries, I think.
Mhm.
Does that help? Some of it's a matter of taste. Again, some people prefer realism. Some people prefer new perspectives. I really appreciate like different global representations to see how folks from different cultures have made this story their own,
Mhm.
and not just a story about first century people.
Mhm. Okay.
Matt.
This, yeah, Dwayne.
So I'm wondering about, since you raised the question of theology, the Mosaic prohibition against images, thou shalt have no other gods before me, and the early church that we don't even really have texts from, and that development over time. Is there something about either the gospel and its structure, or the imagination, or resurrection that sort of brings out a different, I mean, we're also bringing in the culture of the Gentile, and you mentioned Rome and the Roman emperor that converts. I mean, is there, maybe that's too big of a question, but I mean, it's certainly worth noticing that art is okay, and it doesn't necessarily mean, the symbolization of it doesn't mean just eroticism or some cultural expression short of the message of the gospel of the divine human, and the death and resurrection. The cross, of course, is that. You can't really take the cross out of the gospel or the resurrection, but when you get a fuller figuring of humanity, or what's going on in the world now in our presence, even if it's still the cross.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still a cross through history. It's not just cross out of time. Anything about that worth drawing?
Yeah, I mean, you do have the prohibition against images in the Ten Commandments. This is largely I think a response against idolatry. This concern that people will worship anything, and folks in ancient Israel thought that the one, in their perspective, the one true God shouldn't be depicted as an animal or some other deity, and it was a way of setting their religion apart from the religion of their neighbors. Of course, Jews today still tend to follow that, but that doesn't mean there's not really good Jewish art that depicts biblical scenes and the power of God at work. The Christian church has, to the best of my knowledge, never really been, at least in the mainstream, has never really been anxious about depicting Jesus artistically. Of course, I think most Muslims won't depict the Prophet Muhammad. They see that as not just a distraction, but you're bound to diminish him if you depict him artistically. Christians have, for the most part, been more open to depicting Jesus. As a Presbyterian, I belong to a denomination that doesn't have a good history with art and images, because in the 16th century, the leading reformers were afraid that images would distract you from the word. And so the written word or the spoken word was the centerpiece. And so they broke stained glass windows, and they refused to put images in. I lived in New Jersey for 8 years prior to moving to Minnesota. And when I first came to Westminster, my first thought was, this is not a Presbyterian building, because my previous 8 years had been in churches that were all kind of the New England meeting house style, that were all clear glass windows. They were all flat. There were no raised areas. There were no depiction. The only symbol in the entire place was a lone cross, you know, and coming to Westminster with all the art and the windows, you know, it felt like I was not in a Presbyterian church. I think the Presbyterian church in the last 100 years or so has recognized what a mistake that was to view art and symbolism suspiciously or as a distraction. And as a result, it distances us from artists, which is a shame. It also distances a lot of people who have different, you know, ways of learning, right? Who would process the world more visually than textually. I don't know if that helps. I mean, but and you know, and there's nothing worse than being in a worship space where there's really bad art right in front of you. Maybe some of you have been in churches like this. I can name a few in the Twin Cities where you're trying to focus and there's just awful painting or sculpture up front. So I get that, right? But you can't please everybody's tastes. And sometimes somebody donates a big statue of Jesus and there's no getting rid of it. Yeah. I don't know if that helps, right? But that's the problem of going to church with other people. You have to put up with everybody else's aesthetics. That was kind of a joke. But I'm going to move on to the next part. But before I do that, I'm going to ask you to quickly forgive me for one thing, which is I started this on my laptop and I didn't bring my power cord into this room. And I'm at like 37% and diminishing rapidly. So I'm just going to pause for 1 minute. I swear, just 1 minute, and I'll be right back. And then I won't have to worry of my computer going dark on me. Is that all right? All right, hold on. Don't anybody go anywhere.
Anybody here signed up to go to church on Easter Sunday? I'm at Westminster, being live. Not you're on mute, Jane. You're on mute, so we can't hear you.
I want to sing, so I'm staying.
Hey, I'm back.
Right. I'm gonna try to go to the early service. I haven't been accepted yet, so we'll see. 7 o'clock, and then
Sorry to be gone. Here we are, like a year. We're like a year into the pandemic, and I still can't get Zoom right, but getting better. So let me move on in terms of the next phase, I guess, for tonight. I'm going to go back to sharing the screen. One of the things, and this gets back to a question earlier, one of the things I wanted to emphasize in this series was this, that so much of Christian tradition or Christian theology has taught us, at least it's taught me, to look at Jesus' death and to ask, what does this do for us, right? What does this accomplish? What has God done here? That's not a bad question, but I do think that the Gospels and this idea of having to experience the Gospels and having to experience the way in which they describe the death of Jesus, that raises interesting questions for historians, certainly, and I love talking about those and where these stories came from and how ancient people might have experienced them. But one of the things I've been wanting to do with this series is to keep these other questions in front of us, right? What does this event, what does the death of Jesus say about us? And what does it say about God if we understand the Christian confession that Jesus is not just another human being just like me, but is actually divine as well? Or what does it mean for God to be present or to be absent from this event? That those kinds of questions are also really important. And so I want to make sure tonight that we have opportunity to deal with some of those two harder questions. Maybe they're all hard questions, but definitely to keep our attention on the last two as well, so we don't treat the cross as a puzzle to solve or a riddle to try to guess its answer, but also to recognize that it's a moment in which I think we learn something about humanity and we learn something about divinity as well. So for these last 4 weeks, I have, if you remember, at the beginning of each of the 4 sessions, I've tried to offer a bit of historical background to give us all a sense of some of what was going on in the ancient world, or some of what the historical or political realities were so that we interpret Jesus' story in light of those. And so before we talked about Mark's gospel, I mentioned the horror of crucifixion, talked about how this was not, this was a way of executing people that the Romans were fond of, that they had a lot of practice at. They crucified a lot of people, but it wasn't their only way of executing their prisoners or people that they thought were worthy of dying. Crucifixion was reserved for people of very low status, for slaves, for revolutionaries, for people whose lives didn't seem to matter that much. And crucifixion took time, it took resources, it took soldier power. And so, it was a way in which the Romans were not just interested in deterrence, but they were interested in trying to stamp out movements, or trying to make horrific examples of some people, and trying to diminish not just them, but their ideas, their followers, anybody who would dare to imitate them. It was a way of reasserting Roman imperial dominance over many, many parts of the empire and many parts of life. The second thing, in the second week that I talked about when we were looking at Matthew, was the relationship between the religious and the political authorities that we encounter in the gospel accounts. Often we see Jesus before the Jewish high priest and the other chief priests, and we think, oh, that was his religious trial. And then when they bring him before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, people will say, well, that must be the political trial. Most of us in America have been conditioned to think of religion and politics as very separate things, that they should be very separate things. I'm not so sure they always are entirely separate, that we're very good at separating them. But in the ancient world, nobody would have thought to try to separate those two things. Right? Emperors, Roman emperors in the late 1st century and beyond, started to demand worship, right? They had religious services meant to honor them. They knew the power of religion to cement their political authority. So much of Judaism, even at that time as well, had deep concerns about Jewish autonomy and what it would look like for the nation to be restored. And so the Jewish chief priest the Jewish high priest and the chief priests around him were people whose primary authority was over the temple, but they were also people that the Roman government or the Roman, power structure had empowered or had authorized to take care of daily business, right? To keep the peace, to make sure tax collection was going on. So they and Pilate, in some ways, they and Pontius Pilate have some mutual benefit, perhaps, in doing away with Jesus. And so it's a reminder that their reasons for perhaps wanting to do away with Jesus are not just about jealousy or not just about a kind of political offense. There are bigger power structure issues at work in those parts of the story. When we talked about Luke's gospel, we talked about Jesus' identity as a rejected prophet. This is a really prominent theme in the gospel according to Luke, that Jesus comes into the city looking like a prophet, looking like a king, and the city as a whole seems to reject him. And this is part of the tragedy of Luke's story. It looks like one more of God's messengers whom God has sent to try to get the people to turn, or try to get the people to discover something new, has been ignored by those to whom he was sent. And then we looked at John's gospel. We talked about the connections to Passover. Remember last week I talked about how Matthew, Mark, and Luke set the death of Jesus on the first day of Passover, right? The morning after the big Passover meal of the first night of Passover. While in John's gospel, he's crucified the afternoon before Passover begins. And there's a discrepancy there. But at the heart of this, I think, is an invitation to view what's happening to Jesus somehow in light of the Passover story. And I'll say more about that in just a minute. But hopefully those sound familiar. Those are the four themes that we talked about, these historical kind of context setting. And so I want to walk through each of those briefly and just talk about the importance that they bear really for all four gospels. Whoops, I'll come back to that. Hold on a second. The horror of crucifixion, talk about this with regard to Mark, that in Mark's gospel, nobody is with Jesus. None of his friends, at least, are with him. That he dies saying, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" that it looks like utter failure. There's nobody converts alongside of him. The only prospect perhaps of good news is that the temple curtain is torn. That might be good news, it might be bad news. And the centurion says, surely this man was God's son. But otherwise, it looks like a horrific event. And Mark, it seems, wants us to remember that this is the kind of death Jesus dies. As a thought experiment, we might ask the question, what would be different about the church if Jesus had not died of crucifixion? What if he had been simply run through with a sword in a Roman barracks somewhere like that, out of sight, out of mind? What if Jesus had not died in a public way? What if he had not died in a humiliating way? What if he hadn't died in a way that's involved exposure and involved humiliation? Would our symbolism be different? Absolutely. Would our theology be different, or would our understanding of Christian faith be different? I think probably slightly. I don't know what that would look like, but it's a reminder that Christians talk about not simply the fact that Jesus died for us, or to use the language of died for our sins or died because of our sins, but that Jesus was crucified in that way. That seems to be really important for the gospel authors to remind us. It certainly is important for the Apostle Paul in his letters, where he says, it's significant that we believe the power of God is revealed in what looks like a moment of absolute weakness. There's this upside down logic to crucifixion that Paul talks about. I want to put a quote up here. This is a quote I actually used in a sermon at Westminster several months ago. I'm going to recycle it. I hope you'll forgive me for that. But it's from a book by a British author named Francis Spufford. I know very little about him, but this is kind of his version of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, if you've ever read that book. I mean, he's basically trying to convince a contemporary audience, not convince is not the right word, he's trying to explain to a contemporary audience why Christian faith is appealing to him. And when he talks about the crucifixion, he says this. He says, like a tragedy, the story of the death of Jesus, it stirs up pity and terror in us. Like a tragedy, it requires us to contemplate the world's darkness. Like a tragedy, it draws attention to waste. It shows us a life that need not have been extinguished, being extinguished, without particular malice by the normal processes of the world. Right? There's something very ordinary about this story, right? It magnifies so much of what's wrong with the world, and also what's really ordinary about the world. Let me pick up the quote. It shows us that accident, injustice, spoilage are all standard, all in the pitiable usual course of things. Here it's important that Jesus's death was an obscure one when it happened. He's not a King Oedipus or a Prince Hamlet, someone falling from greatness. His death belongs beside the early cutting short of the millions of lives of people too poor or too unimportant ever to have been recorded in the misleading story we call history. People only mourned by others as brief as themselves, and therefore gone from human memory as if they had never been. Jesus dies like a migrant worker who suffers in a freight container, like a garbage picker caught in a slide, like a child with an infected finger, like a beggar the bus reverses over. Or, of course, like all the other slaves ever punished by crucifixion, a fate so low, said Cicero, famous Roman, that no bred person should ever mention it. Christians believe that Jesus' death is, among other things, a way for God to mention it loudly and with no good breeding at all, a declaration by the maker of the world in pain and solidarity that to him the measure of the waste of history is not the occasional tragedies of kings, but the routine losses of every day. I love this quote. I think it encapsulates something really true about crucifixion, especially as we see it in Mark's gospel and Matthew's gospel, that it is a story of waste, or a story of apparent misunderstanding, either of a horrible accident or of a horrible misuse of power. But the kind of stuff that you can see all the time if you just turn on the news and watch for a couple of hours. So I want to hold that up there as one thing. I also want to come back to this relationship between the religious and the political authorities. One of the things about the crucifixion, as the Gospels describe it, that's really haunting to me is that some of the people who appear to be orchestrating it, as the Gospels tell the story, aren't the worst of the worst. Some of them appear to be, from the perspective of many, the best of the best. They appear to be people who have a religious vision, have a commitment to God, to discovering and living into God's goodness. That the temple leaders aren't necessarily corrupt by definition, but something's wrong and something has happened. I'm not so sure we're supposed to imagine Pilate as such a sympathetic figure, but I do worry that when we make the religious leaders this other, and we kind of put them out there as these arch villains without recognizing the way they might resemble us. I like this quote, another long quote for you. This is from a former teacher of mine named Donald Jewell. He says this, for us, the cross ought to be a sober reminder of how easily the most noble motives can be perverted. The cross, points up how quickly an institution can become an end in itself, stifling legitimate concerns of those outside that may seem to threaten stability. The cross, illustrates how frequently insidious forces we scarcely notice can transform the best educated, best intentioned among us into insensitive leaders, desperately out of touch with what's real. There's something frightening predictable about the way that people with power operate, eager to impose their authority on others, struggling for position. So for me, what does the cross tell us about us? This is something else that it tells us. It tells us the way in which sometimes religious power can leave us out of touch with what's around, can leave us out of touch with the ways in which God might be breaking in all around us, right? Or in other aspects of our lives. That there's the kind of callousness toward Jesus' life in the story is a callousness that I think I'm capable of too, and recognize in myself. The third one, Jesus' identity as a rejected prophet, I think is significant. I mentioned Luke's gospel makes a big deal out of this. For Luke, and I think also this is true for the other gospels, Jesus is one more example of a way in which God is trying to actualize God's promises, have people encounter God's love, but they miss it. They miss the boat. At least the majority of people somehow fail to recognize what's there in front of them. And that makes it a story of missed opportunity in a lot of ways for people. It also makes it a story of God's determination to get our attention and to convince us of God's presence or of God's love. This is also a place where sometimes a lot of Christian discussion about the death of Jesus can veer into anti-Semitism. When Christian retelling of the story of Jesus becomes a way of saying, well, this is when the Jewish people misunderstood, and as a result, now the Gentiles started to discover. Or when Christian preaching sometimes finds a way of blaming the people of Jerusalem for their rejection of Jesus, and that becomes then punished by the destruction of the temple in the year 70, 40 years later. I mean, there's ways in which this creeps into a lot of Christian preaching. I might have mentioned before in this series, throughout a lot of the Middle Ages and even beyond in the modern period, one of the most dangerous days to be Jewish was on Good Friday, when Christians would be, kind of whipped up into an anti-Jewish frenzy by Good Friday services and go out and commit violence against Jewish neighbors. This is part of the story that I think we need to handle with care, recognize it's there, that it's part of the tradition. But it doesn't have to necessarily be the place we go when we talk about Jesus as one who's been rejected. For a quote here, I chose something out of the Bible. This is in the book of Acts, essentially the sequel to Luke's gospel. This is early on in the book of Acts, when Peter and John are preaching to people in the Jerusalem temple. These are just rank and file residents of Jerusalem that they're talking to. And they say this: you rejected the holy and righteous one and asked to have a murderer given to you. Reference there is to Barabbas. And you killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. To this we are witnesses. Then look at the move here that takes place. Friends, I know that you acted in ignorance, as did also your rulers. In this way, God fulfilled what God had foretold through all the prophets, that God's Messiah would suffer. So there's this interesting, you're guilty of rejection, but you also did this in ignorance. There's an interesting kind of maybe not excusing, but a way of explaining that rejection, and then also saying this is something about God's foretelling, as if this is nothing new to God. The response then, this is what is the cross supposed to do, perhaps, right? The response, at least according to Acts chapter 3, is repentance, right? Repent, therefore, and turn to God so that your sins may be wiped out, right? What's the proper response to hearing the story of Jesus' confession? Repentance and turning to God. So that times of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord, and that God may send the Messiah appointed for you, that is Jesus, who must remain in heaven until the time of universal restoration that God announced long ago through his holy prophets. This idea that all of the prophets throughout the Old Testament are trying to prompt repentance. Jesus, in a way, tries to prompt repentance. He does that not only through his message, but even through his death. The last thing I want to highlight is, again, the connection to Passover and the Passover story that we encounter in the book of Exodus. If you're not familiar with that, Passover is instituted as the last of a series of plagues that God through Moses announces to the Egyptian Pharaoh, right? Let the Hebrew slaves go, let them go and cross into their own land that God has prepared for them. That's the story. After Pharaoh refuses to let them go over and over and over again, finally God announces that the firstborn of all Egyptians are going to die one night, and to prevent Hebrews, the children in Hebrew families from dying, they are to slaughter a lamb, put blood on the doorpost, have a meal, and then get ready to run, get ready to travel. And then the story of the Red Sea crossing, pictured here with Miriam and the other women singing after the destruction of the Egyptian army. That connection to Passover is not really made very explicit in the gospel stories, but they all recognize it, that something new is happening this Passover. On the one hand, from the perspective of Good Friday, it looks like disappointment, right? On a day meant to commemorate God's provision for God's people, the Messiah dies and God appears to be powerless, perhaps. From the perspective of Easter Sunday, there's this idea that something new is taking place. I talked last week that the Passover lamb wasn't necessarily a sacrifice to forgive sins, but was a way a way in which blood symbolized protection, a way in which blood symbolized God's provision for God's people. And so this is a reminder that the gospel stories are very interested in a lot of symbolism. They're interested in pulling on some threads that remind us of ways in which God is faithful, at least in the stories throughout Scripture. And here I'm thinking largely of the Old Testament. What's the Passover story about? It's largely, I think, a story of protection and preservation of God's people. The Egyptians probably have a different point of view on this. The ancient Egyptians would. We'll come back maybe on another day, but at least in the perspective of the Hebrew slaves, right? Protection and preservation. Also deliverance and liberation. The story of Passover isn't just about children being protected. It's also a story then about fleeing across the Red Sea and moving into a new existence, deliverance out of slavery. That language as well is connected in some way, or at least it's echoed, or at least you might hear those bells ringing in your head when you hear the story of Jesus' death. When we move to like other New Testament writings, and this is where, like for example, the Apostle Paul likes to talk about justification, right? He will say, well, the cross is a story of our being justified or our being set right with God. It fixes a broken relationship. It pulls us out of a kind of ignorance toward God to a way of participating in God's blessings. Paul can't make up his mind, or at least Paul doesn't use just one image. Paul also says that the cross is a story of reconciliation, of humanity being reconciled back to God, of all humanity being reconciled to God and to each other. It's also a story of redemption. Again, this is language Paul likes to use. Redemption, being brought back. Once upon a time, we used to redeem our bottles, our glass bottles, right? Bring them back to the store and sell them back. It's a story of being brought back to where we belong, back to God's embrace. Paul uses the language of new creation in some places, that somehow the cross represents the turning of a new page in the history of the world and new ways of being in the world. There are also some New Testament authors that use sacrificial imagery to describe the cross. We talked about this a tiny bit last week. I've kind of downplayed this through the last 4 weeks. For a lot of people, this is the primary way of looking at the cross. There are a lot of sermons out there, a lot of explanations out there of the cross as being the need to have a sinless victim put to death for the sake of sinful people. What I read from Jewish scholars about theologies of sacrifice in the Old Testament make me wonder how helpful that is. Ways in which sometimes sacrificial-based theology gets used to excuse violence sometimes worries me. And so I personally, in my own life of faith, don't find sacrificial imagery necessarily very helpful, although I recognize it's there in a lot of pages in the New Testament. And we can perhaps talk about that some more, but I just want to highlight on this screen, there are a variety of ways in which the image of Passover or other kinds of ways of Jesus accomplishing something or expressing love through dying on behalf of others are also really important, at least biblical symbols or biblical resonances with Jesus' death. And that, of course, opens up a whole lot of other ways of thinking about how does the cross of Jesus tell us something about who God is and about who we are. It opens up, I think, a way of viewing God as a liberator, as somebody who is committed to reaching out to humanity and to ushering humanity into a new state of affairs. And the resurrection, of course, is part of that as well. You got to stop somewhere. So, I've done this series only on the death of Jesus. We could do several weeks on Easter and the resurrection of Jesus. For the most part, the New Testament authors speak about cross and resurrection together, or death and resurrection together. Viewing the death of Jesus alone is not the entire story. So, for a lot of these notions of protection, preservation, deliverance, liberation, et cetera, the idea of a God who doesn't let death have the last word is also really important. But this is the liberation that it's talking about. I like this piece by Carl Dixon, an African-American artist who's got Easter there right in the center of the piece of Jesus emerging from the tomb, but that also being flanked on the left by Moses leading people out of slavery through the Red Sea. And on the right, we have Harriet Tubman leading the Underground Railroad as another symbol of liberation, that there are expressions of new life that pop up all over the place. This piece of art is not a depiction of death, but it's a depiction of what deliverance out of what death-dealing types of situations might look like. And I think the Passover imagery in the Gospels, or at least the Passover setting in the Gospels, is important, again, as a reminder of a God who promises that protection and preservation, and finally liberation. That's my presentation for tonight. I hope that's at least pulls together some things or helps you see that some of these details that might have been disconnected, I think, come together in some ways. People have been talking about the cross for 2,000 years and obviously have not exhausted their understanding of what it means and what it looks like, and how we continue to process it through a lens that's ever changing, right? As we encounter injustices in our own world, as we encounter disappointments in our own personal lives, and as we encounter as well opportunities for new life and hope and rebirth in our own experience. I do have some discussion questions, of course, as well. I'll post those now just so you know what they are. But I also want to open up some time if there are questions. I spoke more tonight than I thought I would, but I seem to have a habit of doing that, I recognize. But there are at least the 3 questions I thought of. If you're not planning to stick around, you might want to copy and paste them just so you can ponder them on your own, if that's what you like to do. If you want to see a link, you can get all 3 of them on a document if you click that link in the chat as well. But before we disperse into smaller groups, is there any other questions or comments, or have I offended anybody or left anything tantalizingly open? I see Brent waving at me. There might be others.
My question was, which one of the Gospels do you think has the most unique or singular voice in terms of the way they depict the crucifixion?
I think John by far. I mean, I think John in general is the outlier of all four. John is so rich in a lot of symbolism. John is so, and they all have their mystery, but Jesus talks a lot in John, and he talks a lot about himself in John. One of my teachers says that's why they kill him in John's gospel, because he won't stop talking about himself. Little tongue in cheek there. But when Jesus is done talking, it's often not any clearer than it was before he started. You know? But that's, I think, yeah, John's the gospel that draws mystics to it. It draws poets to it more so than the other ones. But the story of Jesus' death in John's gospel is very much a story, I think, of Jesus' own agency and kind of his control or command over the situation. He has a job to do. He has love to show, and crucifixion is how he's going to do it. And when he's done, he decides it's time to die. So again, this is just personal. There's no expertise here. I have to be in the right mood to handle John's crucifixion story personally, because it sounds a little too superhero-ish to me some days. But there's some days where I need a superhero, and then I'm really attracted to it.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions? Yeah, Ken.
Can you say a couple of words about the transfiguration story in the different gospels, and are they aligned in the same kind of way as you've described the crucifixion stories in the four gospels?
The transfiguration stories, we get them in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. They're pretty similar. They each have little variations, but that's true anytime they all tell the same story. They have little variations, and scholars love to look at those for hints about, what their theologies were. But they're pretty much the same, with a few variations here and there. Like, they all involve Moses and Elijah, and they all involve Jesus being transformed. They all have Peter saying something stupid, or Peter not fully understanding what's going on, and they also have a voice coming from the cloud. So I don't think they don't necessarily map very well on the crucifixion story. They do sound a lot like the baptism of Jesus, where again, in all three of those gospels, John doesn't describe the baptism of Jesus. In all three of those gospels, at the baptism, a voice is heard from the heavens. Sometimes only Jesus hears it. Sometimes the crowd hears it, identifying him as a beloved son. And the same thing happens at the transfiguration. So they both have this sense of, what's the word I want? Not quite commissioning, but a kind of inaugurating or a kind of divine validation of Jesus' identity. And the baptism, of course, is what launches his ministry. The transfiguration stories come right around the first time Jesus speaks about his pending death. So does that help? I mean,
it's not a surprise then that that Jesus is on the way towards death. We don't know exactly how he's going to die at the transfiguration story, but we know that he's in covenant with God in that journey. And it's always been, I don't know, maybe simplistically, it's always been comforting to know that, God and Jesus are in covenant as whatever is about to transpire is going to transpire, so that regardless of how horrific it is or how heroic it is, it's founded in the same belief.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I can imagine somewhere a conversation like, was crucifixion really the right thing? Was like, and that the placement of the transfiguration near where Jesus starts talking about an upcoming death seems to be a confirmation that he's not a rogue agent now. He's still doing what he's supposed to do, because you can imagine people wondering, like, That seems like a really bad idea. And that's the inverted logic of the Christian story in the New Testament, right? That what looks like powerlessness is really a display of God's power. What looks like failure is really the start of something new. I mean, it's, yeah, Manly.
I can't remember the last time I heard a sermon in a Presbyterian church that dwelt on the atonement. That sacrificial part seems to be something that we don't talk about anymore. And yet, when some of you may remember the Reimagining Conference of 20 plus years ago, where a lot of people got very upset, and part of it, I think, was women asserting their right to do things. But I think in terms of doctrine and so forth, the most comments were about Dolores Williams' comment that says, "We don't need no bloody cross. We don't need this as a part of our theology." Where do you see the atonement in terms of where the Presbyterian Church is these days?
Yeah, that's a big question. Can I provide a little background in case people are wondering? Manly mentioned the Reimagining Conference. This was a conference that was held in Minneapolis that got a lot of news attention and became kind of infamous, although the speakers at this conference and the things they said weren't anything new. I mean, these have been circulating in a lot of theological discussions for a long time. It was largely driven by, the conference was largely an expression of, I'd say about 30 years, maybe probably even more than that, but certainly 30 years of a lot of feminist theology, a lot of feminist theologians speaking out about the ways in which a lot of Christian doctrine and symbolism was proving to be harmful to women, period. And by harmful, I mean, literally harmful because of a number of reasons, but some of it had to do with, like you said, these ways of thinking about the atonement. By the atonement, that's the question of what does God do through the cross, or what does Jesus fix as a result of the crucifixion, or what gets mended. And what the pushback was against was, again, a lot of the sacrificial imagery, that the idea of a God who demands blood, innocent blood, in order for sins to be forgiven. You might think that nobody ever says that, though, do they? And in some pulpits in this country, people do. And there's some biblical passages that come pretty close to saying that. There are problems with that. There are many problems with that. But one of the things that the conference brought up was, this is the kind of logic that that fuels domestic violence. This is the kind of logic that fuels people feeling they've got to stay in an abusive relationships. That's what I meant when I said this is just bad for women. It was partly that, as well as the idea. A lot of African-American theologians bristled at the notion of a theology that demands a scapegoat, right? There's got to be somebody that the sins get placed on, that then, like the actual goat in the Old Testament, because a lot of those theologians were saying, we're kind of the American scapegoats. That's bleeding into our societal imagination. I think what they're saying, what they said was right. I think, to put it bluntly, I think that a lot of the ways in which some of that sacrificial theology was being used had more to do with kind of like the culture of medieval serfdom than it does the Bible in a lot of ways. Like this imagination that humanity has accumulated a long ledger of sin, and it simply can't work hard enough to pay off that debt. And then the blood of an innocent victim is what pays the debt. I mean, you've probably heard this. I mentioned C.S. Lewis and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe a couple of weeks ago. It's that kind of theology, which has a great appeal because it makes sense. And I think it fits a transactional culture's way of thinking, right? That you get what you pay for, and people who do this deserve that, and people who don't do these things deserve bad things. Which is so deeply ingrained in a lot of our ways of being. So when I say it's attractive because it makes sense, but where I think it doesn't make sense is that it does paint out God to be potentially an abuser or bloodthirsty in a way that's uncomfortable, as well as perhaps morally problematic. But for me, the biggest problem that I experience, again, this is me, is it paints God as one who really wants to forgive, but just can't. Unless there's a price paid, you know what I mean? And that doesn't sound very godlike to me, because there's plenty of other stories of God freely forgiving. And there's plenty of stories in the Gospels where Jesus says to people, your sins are forgiven. This is before the crucifixion, where he's pronouncing forgiveness. And so I don't think the problem that I don't think the problem that the New Testament imagines is we've got this list of sins that's way too long. And how do we appease an angry God? Somebody step up here, and Jesus says, well, I'll do that. I'll do that work. That's not the God I think we encounter in most of the pages of Scripture. I don't say that to try to if anybody's feeling like their way of viewing the cross is now lying in pieces on the floor. That was a really fast and sloppy criticism of it. And there's ways to talk more about that. And I'm happy to follow up with any of you in more detail as well. But I think you're right, Manly. This is maybe the question you actually asked as opposed to the answer I gave, that at least in most Presbyterian circles, the move has been much more to talking about the cross as liberation, or the cross as a means by which God shows solidarity with the poor and suffering of this world. And what gets revealed in the cross is God's presence in the world in the uglier places, kind of that Francis Spufford quote that I gave earlier, as opposed to a God who can only be worshiped in really clean houses of worship by people who have got their lives together. I think the crucifixion is much more of an expression of divine presence in places that we thought were beyond God's reach. But, yeah, Margaret, sorry, I'm just trying to scan for hands here.
Yeah, just for your information, I just received the latest Christian Century, and one of the lead articles is on substitutionary atonement and how the author has come to embrace it again. So it may be back in our conversations.
Maybe it'll come back into vogue. Yeah, it's possible. It's not horrible. I mean, and again, if this notion of atonement is new to people, there are a variety of theories that have always been kind of competing throughout Christian theological circles. A defeat of the devil and things like that. This idea of a ransom that has to be paid to set prisoners free and things like that. I will tell you what I tell students all the time is that the New Testament does not give one statement about what happens on the cross. It gives multiple ones. And the reason for that is not because nobody can make up their mind or nobody has any idea. It's because I think it's a mystery. And mystery doesn't mean we'll never figure it out, or it means that it's encoded and you need somebody really smart to figure it out. By mystery, I just mean that it's experienced in a whole variety of ways, and there's no one metaphor that can fully encapsulate all of what it's about. So I would say that would be my response to that, but I'll have to look for that article. Should we go to smaller groups? How about that? Good. Are people staying around? I'm happy to break us into breakout rooms. All right. Otherwise, thank you for being part of this. You'll hear from me on email about the next time I'm having a gathering.